Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, Let's Talk Taxes. My name is Valerie Hammertsfelder, and I am the Vice President of the League of Women Voters, Greater Cleveland. We are grateful that you chose to spend your Tuesday evening with us learning about some of Ohio's tax issues, a topic which is certainly top of mind after the recently passed state biennial budget, this month's elections, the recent property reappraisals, and cuts to many education, public safety, and social safety net programs from the federal level. Before I introduce tonight's program, I would like to share a little bit of information about the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse candidates or parties. However, nonpartisan does not mean the organization is not politically active. For over 100 years, the League of Women Voters has worked to educate voters, encourage informed and active participation in government, increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influence public policy through education and advocacy. Several of the League's voter education efforts include hosting nonpartisan candidate forums, creating voter registration and candidate guides, circulating information to voters via print and electronic media, and developing and presenting educational forums to increase understanding on a variety of issues affecting voters and democracy. The League engages in both broad educational efforts as well as advocacy at all three levels of government. Our issues are grounded in our respected history of working to make democracy function for all Americans. If you would like to work to empower voters and defend democracy, your local league would love to have you join us. Tonight, our educational efforts lead us to talking taxes. The state's recent biennial budget included some significant changes to Ohio's income taxes and property taxes. Recent league programs, including those put on by leagues in Hudson and Lakewood, have looked at the impact of federal budget cuts and state tax changes on schools and libraries, as well as public safety and health services. LWV Ohio has been tracking and helping us to understand the many tax-related bills that have been introduced in the Ohio State House, and tonight's program is a continuation of this work. Together, we are diving into this complex and important topic. We hope you come away from tonight's program with greater clarity on tax issues in Ohio and a framework for asking the necessary questions. Now, to introduce our speakers, first up will be Dr. Karen Leith of Hudson, Ohio. Dr. Leith is currently the Advocacy Chair for the League of Women Voters of Ohio. Over the past 6 years, she has rebuilt advocacy resources, revitalized the lobby corps, and worked with local leagues to find ways to speak out on priority issues. As a member of the Hudson League since 1981, Karen has held every office in our local league over the years. Dr. Leith has worked with Ohio's local leagues on crafting positions on issues such as charter schools, health equity, arming school personnel, criminal justice, and ranked choice voting. Tonight, she'll be providing us with information regarding the league's positions on taxes. For our panel discussion, Anna Staver will be our moderator. Anna is an Emmy Award-winning journalist who covers the Ohio State House for Cleveland.com and the Plain Dealer. She writes about budgets, taxes, public pension systems, and anything wonky or complicated. Before moving to Columbus in 2019, she covered lawmakers in Colorado, Idaho, and Oregon. Anna also let us know that her articles covering tax issues are often some of her most responded to articles. Anna will be moderating the discussion between our two panelists, State Senator Louis Blessing and Policy Matters Ohio Research Director Zach Schiller. State Senator Blessing is serving his second term in the Ohio Senate. He currently represents Ohio's 8th Senate District. He began his career in the legislature serving as a member of the Ohio House of Representatives, representing the 29th Ohio District. Senator Blessing has an extensive background in electrical engineering. He currently works as an engineer at Super Systems, Inc. in Cincinnati, and previously worked at Duke Energy and Nova Engineering. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics and Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering at the University of Cincinnati. The senator is a licensed professional engineer and is a member of the Ohio Society of Professional Engineers. He currently resides in Coleraine Township with his wife Heather and their 3 sons. Zach Schiller is the Research Director of Policy Matters Ohio. a nonprofit research institute with offices in Cleveland and Columbus. Prior to coming to Policy Matters Ohio in 2001, Zach worked for more than 2 decades researching and writing about the Ohio economy as a business reporter for the Plain Dealer and Business Week. His education includes a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University and a bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan. At Policy Matters Ohio, Zach has written about numerous issues important to Ohio residents, including foreclosures, economic development, job growth, unemployment insurance, and tax policy. Next, I would like to mention a few housekeeping guidelines. We respectfully ask that everyone here please be present and be respectful. Also, we ask that you assume good intent from all participants. Please recognize that the materials, statements, and opinions provided in our program are private to the organization and should not be shared without specific consent from the League of Women Voters or the speakers. No party shall record, tape, or otherwise capture, reproduce, or broadcast any audio, video, or digital content from this session without specific consent from the League of Women Voters. Now to dive into our agenda. Karen Leaf will be up next to provide a quick run-through of the League's positions on taxes. Then we will turn the program over to our moderator, Anna Staver, and our experts, Senator Blessing and Zach Schiller. We want to hear from you throughout the night as well, so we will leave time following the panel discussion to address your questions. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat as we go along. We have several helpers that will be monitoring the chat, and they will relay your questions to the moderator. We have also provided the moderator with questions that were submitted by attendees as they registered. Thank you very much to everyone that submitted or submits a question. We will try to get to as many as possible. If we are unable to get to your question, please look for additional programming from the League in the future. Now I will turn it over to Karen.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Tonight, to begin with, I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to give you some context and a little bit of history in terms of our positions. The League actually started studying state finance in 1969. At that time, state finance was service based on education, welfare, and mental health. Due to the climate at that time, local leagues petitioned the LWVO State Board for a comprehensive study that began in 1981. A giant study committee was put together and a timeline was set. The sales tax and property tax positions were added as a result in 1983, with the corporate franchise and income taxes in 1987. Then, in 2004, the General Assembly appointed a committee to study state and local taxes. In 2004, the General Assembly appointed this committee, while the final 2004-2005 budget did include some of those tax changes. It neither addressed the structural deficit nor reduced the tax equity gap. But that sparked a momentum that has continued to today, especially in terms of using the budget to make changes. And we just saw that even in the last budget with the income tax becoming a flat tax. Therefore, in 2007, LWVO appointed a study group to review and make recommendations to update our positions in light of the creation of the commercial activity tax, known as CAT, which is based on gross receipts, and the phasing out of the corporate finance and personal property taxes. Those were very old taxes. Ohio has had taxes since the 19th century, and some of those changed. In fact, the personal property tax changed to a tangible property tax in 1931, and it was used mostly by businesses and was finally phased out in 2005. So LWVO's position on state finance and taxation was updated in December of 2010. Every year, we ask our leagues to look over the positions to tell us if they need updating or to approve them as they are. And that has happened consistently. The main part and the basis of our total position is what you see on your screen now, the criteria. This is the most important part. It basically gives us 4 principles we use to evaluate taxes: fair and equitable, provide adequate resources, be understandable to the taxpayer, and encourage compliance, therefore, and be easy to administer. And this was adopted in 1989 as part of that initial comprehensive study. Next slide, please. As I said, that one of the first taxes looked at was the property tax, and you can see that this was adopted in March of 1983. Every year that we've evaluated this, and even in the 2010 review of all our tax and updating of all our tax positions, these 2 principles have stood with our leagues: supporting real property tax relief financed by the state in the form of the homestead exemption. Notice how we, not universally, but based on age, income, and disability income. When we talk about circuit breakers, in terms of being one way of looking at tax relief, it comes from this position. The league therefore supported the elimination of the rollbacks, both across the board and for owner-occupied homes. Going back to supporting and underlying that basis of the circuit breaker. You'll notice the taxes on businesses. We don't specify the type of tax. We just say businesses need to be taxed. They receive the services also. Next slide. We support a personal income tax as the source of state revenue because it meets the fair and equitable tax principles. The state income tax rate should be graduated. So you can see that with this flat tax, we were against that the graduated is an equitable way of taxing. Next slide. Sales tax. This we first adopted in 1983 because it was part of that first study, and then revised in June 1989 when we had been through the other taxes. Basically, we see sales tax as something that is regressive. So we support changes in the base. We look at supporting applications of sales tax to non-essential services. In other words, more the things that common people don't need. And we really support exemptions for the basic essentials in terms of sales tax. We see sales tax, next slide. One of the most important pieces of our tax position is the tax mix. Originally adopted in 1989, but revised in December of 2010. In other words, we're looking at basically those criteria and prioritizing the way we support taxes. So basically, we see the income tax as a graduated tax as the most equitable way because it's progressive rather than regressive, and that applying means testing to state property tax release programs should increase the revenue generated by the tax and make the system more equitable, but not unduly burdening low-income individuals and families. And then basically looking at an increase in sales tax, although less desirable, is another possible revenue source. But notice we put it low on the list of priorities. So together, those are our tax positions. And remember, those base criteria are the way we ask the questions about the taxes. Thank you for allowing me to introduce these principles.
Is it? I
So
think
we
it might be
can
my
turn
turn.
things over to you, Anna. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. Uh, so I wanted to start by sort of making sure that we're all on the same page. So in journalism, we're taught never assume what a reader knows. So let's go through some basics on property taxes to make sure we're all singing from the same hymnal. Like, for example, we only pay property taxes on 35% of what our county thinks our home is worth. And that's really important when you're trying to figure out what a levy might cost you. So, Zach, I want to start with some basics on school taxes because they are inevitably the largest share of our bill. About 60% of the average Ohioan's tax bill goes to public education. In my district, actually, I live just north of Columbus. It's 82% of my property tax bill goes to my schools. So, how does my city run on very little, but my school requires so much of my property taxes?
Well, the main reason for that is that in Ohio, cities rely largely on municipal income tax. And so the average city budget, I believe, gets 60% or more, much like the schools do from the property tax, but from the municipal income tax. And that is actually pretty unusual around the country. But I think that it distinguishes why most often when you're talking property taxes, you're looking at schools as the first and most significant user of that revenue.
So, Senator Blessing, when we talk about property taxes, we're also talking about this schedule for reappraisals. So, this is where your auditor updates what your home is worth. It's done every 3 years, but we don't use 3 years worth of data. So, why did we set this schedule? Why not use an average? Like, what's up with the reappraisal schedule?
So that goes back to, and I asked the same question, and Mike Sobel, who is the longtime property tax guru formerly with the Ohio Department of Taxation, then treasurer for Granville City Schools, and ultimately one of the authors of the Fair School Funding Formula, just pointed me to Article 12, Section 2 of the Constitution, and said, look, property has to be valued at true value, which that has to be as close as possible to an approximation of an arm's length sale, if not an arm's length sale. So a 3-year average would arguably be unconstitutional simply because it's not true value. And when he explained that, it's like, well, okay, pretty good.
Yeah, and so then every 3 years, like a third of the counties, like it's on this rolling schedule. So your county goes through it, and then that's when you get your brand new bill. And Zach, when I look at my property taxes online, I see a list of all the different entities that get my money: schools, parks, libraries, emergency services, mental health boards. I can also see how much they're getting. And in Cuyahoga, if you live in Cuyahoga County, you have an amazing online system that lets you see all of this broken down. But there's two numbers on my personal property tax bill. There's like an actual amount, like an actual millage that I owe, and then there's an effective millage. So can you kind of explain why we see two completely different numbers when we look at our bills?
Well, I think the root of that is what is popularly or not so unpopularly known as House Bill 920. And this goes back to the 1970s, which was the last time that we saw the kind of spike in property values that we have again here recently. And what happened at that time is that the legislature, and eventually this became an article in the Constitution, it said that for most voted property tax levies, if the values go up in the valuations that the senator just was talking about, the rates will come down. And so what that means is that though you may have voted on a levy that was 10 mills, over time that may be reduced because it's being reduced in tandem with the values going up. So the effective millage is looking at what's the real actual rate at which you were being taxed as opposed to the gross millage or the original amounts that were first charged when those levies were first put into effect. Now, this doesn't cover, just to add to the complication, of course, this does not cover all levies. And that's part of the reason that we've seen a lot of the activity in the legislature lately.
Yeah, because some people assume that when their home value goes up, their property tax rises by the same amount. But Senator Blessing, that is not true. And we don't have to get so deep into the weeds on this. But, like, for example, if you live in a school district on something called the 20 mil floor, this is a pretty big exception. And it's something you're tackling in the legislature right now.
Yes, that's correct. And so that's right. Once a school district's effective mill, and this is only 20 mil floor only applies to school districts, but since, as you noted earlier, they're 60% of the property tax burden, roughly speaking, throughout the state, it can seem like that everything is rising in tandem. But what happens is when the effective millage drops and drops and drops for the school district down to 20 mils, then the floor kicks in. So instead of the effective millage dropping and the amount of taxes you're paying remaining effectively flat for those levies, they start to rise with inflation. So if you have a big spike in valuation and you're living in a school district that's on the 20 mil floor, the inside mills, which is the, inside like the 1%, 10 mils of levies that also rise with inflation, coupled with the 20 mil floor levies, now a significant chunk of your property taxes are going to be going up, with the valuation, more so than districts if they were not on the floor. So that is what I think is driving a lot of this, and people are seeing wildly different swings in their property tax burden.
Yeah, the floor is the floor for a reason because it's the minimum amount of funding that the state says a school has to collect in order to get state funding for education. So, but the trouble is, right, like 75, 76%, like three-quarters of the schools in the state are on this floor. Though there's hardly any in Cuyahoga County in particular. It tends to be smaller, more rural districts. But once they're there, it is a one-to-one rise in those property taxes. And some of your colleagues, Senator Blessing, call it unvoted spikes, unvoted increases in their property taxes.
Yes, and I'd like to get into that a little bit later. I will say the school funding formula definitely impacts a lot of this. So the wealthier school districts get less money from the state. So there is a necessity to have a significant local burden because they can ostensibly pay more. So a lot of them are not on the floor. And you're right, it is the local school, or excuse me, the rural school districts almost predominantly that are on the floor. But really, that's changed a lot in recent times. But the one thing that I do want to point out for people when they're like, hey, we got hit with that spike. The difference is that if you are on the 20 mil floor, and you alluded to this earlier, you are literally paying the lowest amount of property taxes for a school district that you can get away with in the state of Ohio. So it's not like you already have like the absolute highest possible property taxes. It just means that they've really dropped below a certain threshold where the state comes in and says, look, you have to have some more skin in it.
So, Zach, sometimes your taxes rise with the value of your home, like we were talking about there, and sometimes they don't, they get reduced. Sometimes the state pays part of your property taxes, but only if a levy passed was for a certain year, or sometimes they cover some of your property taxes if you're of a certain age. I kind of sometimes joke that the system is as bad as English grammar rules because there's an exception to every rule. So, what is really key, do you think, Zach, for people to understand when it comes to how property taxes in Ohio work?
Well, I think the first thing for people to understand is this is all set by the General Assembly. And so if you want to change it or you're dissatisfied with it, this was all set up by the Ohio General Assembly. And the General Assembly is responsible for determining what changes should be made in that system. Now, if you want to learn, as we've already heard, this is a very complicated situation. We're trying to say, here's one thing you should know. I would not want to do that. But I think there are ways you can learn more about this. One is oftentimes county auditor or county treasurer websites will tell you a lot. If you go to the website of the Legislative Service Commission, if you're already confused by some of the terms that we're throwing around here, like inside millage, 20 mil floor, they have what are called members-only briefs, which, despite the name, in fact, are not just for members of the General Assembly. You can go on there and quickly see, okay, what is inside millage? And so rather than us trying to spend all of our time defining all these things here, I'd encourage people to look these things up and, learn accordingly.
And for those wondering, the Legislative Service Commission is a nonpartisan service that basically takes all the different bills that are introduced in the legislature and turns them into plain spoken English. They also do fiscal impact statements, which show how different laws might impact the budgets of either local communities or state governments. They really do the Lord's work. Like if you've never read stuff from LSC, I'm sure Senator Blessing would agree that they are quite a talented and hardworking group of people, and they have a wealth of knowledge that is all publicly available. I don't think I can say enough nice things about LSC, having read probably hundreds and hundreds of pages worth of their work over the years. But Senator Blessing, it is the same question for you. Like, what do you really want people to kind of understand about how the system stands currently before we get into ways that we could change it?
Well, when I look at this, well, for one, I think, and this is just me, in my current state of mind, and I think the previous speaker touched on this in terms of certain taxes are better than than others. The property tax system in Ohio, yes, it is confusing, it's convoluted, very complicated. It's a mishmash of policy between the Constitution and the revised code. But if you just look at purely property taxes, they're actually good taxes. They are efficient, stable taxes. There's a reason why no state has gotten rid of property taxation. There's a reason why they are used predominantly to fund local public goods. And that's because that they are stable, good taxes. And in many ways, a property tax, if you look at it, it's in a roundabout sort of way, it is a wealth tax. So I think people need to understand that, yes, it can be very difficult for a senior on a fixed income to appreciate that, but it's actually a good way to do it. And frankly, we need to, not malign the property tax idea when, it's really all of this, all these Band-Aids that we put on it over the years that are really causing the problems.
So let's talk about how we got to this current crisis. And actually, Zach, I want to start with the income tax. So Ohio, as we said previously, is on the road to eliminating the income tax entirely.
Well, I don't know that I'd agree with that, but okay, go ahead.
Yes, well, I will say it is the goal of the Republican supermajority to eliminate the income tax
for 20
entirely.
years, and we still got 10 billion a year coming in. So
yeah,
give them another 20.
So we are down to a flat tax now, and I would argue that eliminating or reducing the income tax has had a profound impact on our property taxes. And I was hoping you could kind of briefly explain how declining income taxes, particularly the funding of the local government fund, has had an impact on our property taxes.
Sure. Well, starting in 2005, as you said, the legislature has been on a almost continuous path of cutting the income tax. And it's been cut now by more than half, considerably more than half, actually, once you include new deductions and so forth, like the business income deduction. And so that has resulted in a reduction in revenue of well over $10 billion a year. It's probably more like 12, 14 billion a year that we are not bringing in, which is, given we only bring in about 30 billion, that's a heck of a lot of money. That's more than we spend supporting K-12 education from the state, to give you an idea. And that is part of the tie-in, is that we haven't sufficiently supported public education. We didn't fully fund the Fair School Funding Plan that was a bipartisan proposal that was supposed to be fully funded in this budget. And the local government fund, we've not only cut the income tax, we eliminated the estate tax, we're now one of only 6 states without a corporate profits tax. So we've been on a tax cutting spree. And part of this has resulted not only in insufficient funding for K-12 schools, it also has meant that state support of local governments has been reduced or certainly affected. So, for example, we have something called the Local Government Fund, which is a direct revenue sharing of the major state taxes, and a percentage of that goes to cities and villages and other local governments. So right now that percentage is 1.7%. Doesn't sound like much, but it's, what is it? close to $1 billion a year, 700 or 800 million anyway. That percentage was 3.48% previously. So that has been cut by more than half. So that's many hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue that local governments are no longer receiving. And that's just one way in which local governments have lost revenue. The elimination of the estate tax, which was especially important in places like Cincinnati, but other places as well. The end of the tangible personal property tax, which generated $1.8 billion a year in local property taxes. So there have been a whole slew of, there's also been reduction in how much the state reimburses people for some of their property tax. So all this has led to pressure on schools and local governments because they aren't getting the kind of revenue that they otherwise would. And this has helped generate more of the property tax than we otherwise would have seen. And of course, that's very varied across the state, what's happened. But I think that, we used to talk about having a three-legged stool of income, sales, and property taxes. And increasingly, that stool is not really something you could sit on because, the property tax is bringing in 24 billion and the income tax is only bringing in 10 or 11. So, these things are no longer supporting what they used to.
Senator Blessing, Zach touched on the tangible personal property tax. For those who don't know, we used to tax business equipment and machinery, sort of the value of the stuff inside your business. We got rid of that around 2005. And one of the impacts of that was that the share of property taxes paid by homeowners went up. So the amount businesses paid went down, and homeowners went from paying about 50% of all property taxes to paying about 70% today. And Senator Blessing, I have a bit of a difficult question for you. This was largely pushed by your party. Was getting rid of that the right decision? And what do you make of homeowners now covering 70% of the property tax burden?
So whether that was the right decision or not back then, I can't say because I haven't looked at whether the tangible personal property tax is a great tax compared to others. That said, having businesses pay less and less and less in property taxes when residential properties are paying more and more and more, as Dr. Howard Fleeter has so eloquently pointed out over the years, is a major, major problem. But I don't know that it would have been as bad of a problem if we hadn't undertaken some of the other things that Zach was talking about, hadn't been so aggressive with respect to, cutting the income tax. And for what it's worth, that's one of the reasons why I voted against the budget this cycle, because I thought that, look, we needed to finish the fair school funding formula and not plow that into an income tax cut, or go do some sort of state-funded property tax relief in that space. But, I guess for me, I don't want to say I'm ambivalent about the tangible personal property tax, but I guess want to point out that it's part of a larger problem that I'm seeing in the General Assembly where tax cutting has really kind of become a religion where we just cut, we cut, we cut, and that's all we do. Whereas I've, at least in the past 5, maybe 10 years, have taken the ethos, well, wait a minute, taxes are tools. They're not partisan. They're not anything. I view, an income tax like a screwdriver and a sales tax like a hammer. And, what they help us accomplish the political economy we want to achieve. So let's say that the tangible personal property tax, we got rid of that, but then made it up by, well, I guess we can't go back in time, but over time we made it up with an increase in cigarette taxes, which I know typically folks on the left have opposed that because they've viewed it as a tax on the poor. But is it really such a bad policy if it's being plowed into public goods that we depend upon, whether that's affordable housing or education or you name it? Ditto for, the severance tax, we could increase that to what Texas is doing. And that's $500 million that would be flowing in every fiscal year. By the way, the tobacco tax, Indiana just did that. That's $500 million per fiscal year there. But that also mitigates negative externalities. So if you increase that tobacco tax, it also cuts down on smoking, vaping, you name it, which actually cuts, the cost of Medicaid over time. But the thing is we don't take that ethos sometimes in the General Assembly. It's like, well, the attitude seems to be, oh, I don't want to be on record for a tax increase anytime, anywhere, for any reason. Meanwhile, I don't know of any mainstream economists that have ever held that mindset. So I think if we had a sea change there, fighting over the tangible personal property tax would be less of an issue.
So, Zach, you referenced, we were sort of getting to know the property tax system. We talked about House Bill 920, and it was a major piece of property tax reform in the 1970s. And it is probably, and we're coming up on, more than 50 years since we made substantive change. And it seems like we're about to have some pretty significant change passing through and going to the governor's desk this week. I wonder what's your take on what has changed, on why we're talking about property taxes in earnest in 2025 when we haven't been able to get the conversation off the ground in previous years?
Well, I think that the run-up in valuations is obviously the key to that. We saw counties across the state going back to 2023, seeing 30+% increases in valuations. And as the senator noted, in many instances, this did lead actually to more tax increases as opposed to it being steadied or reduced by House Bill 920. I think that this has been overstated. More than 40% of the state lives in school districts that are not at the 20 mil floor. Cuyahoga County saw a 32% increase in values and a 9% increase in taxes. Franklin County saw a 41% increase in values and a 6% increase in taxes. So House Bill 920 is working in major parts of the state. They happen to be the urban and suburban areas rather than the rural and small town areas. I think that what we've seen is the valuations, this effort to repeal the property tax has played into and created a narrative that feeds into an anti-tax platform that is then generating a lot of these different measures, some of them more extreme than others, that effectively are aimed at cutting taxes or constraining tax increases. And I think, well, I don't know if you want to get into discussing what all of them are, but a lot of them are misdirected because they don't actually target who needs the relief. And they're cutting aid. And, we've kind of created a situation where they're busy coming up with these new proposals, and I don't even think it's going to mean much in terms of turning back this proposal. But anyway, you have other questions, so.
Oh, no, we're definitely going to get into all the bills on the table in Columbus in just a moment. But Senator Blessing, I wanted to ask you, how seriously are you taking the proposed constitutional amendment to repeal property taxes? And I wonder, how seriously are your colleagues in the State House taking this possibly being on the ballot in 2026?
I think they're taking it seriously. The difference here is that if you take a step back, it was either North Dakota or South Dakota had a vote on something like this, and it went down pretty handily. It was something like 63-37 in a state that is even redder than Ohio. And, in particular, after a couple Tuesdays ago with this past election where people by and large approved of their tax levies. And understandably, a lot of these were renewals and not new money levies. I think in the General Assembly, there is an understanding that most people view that as a truly unrealistic proposal. And, my colleagues, I think, have a similar sense, even though they're kind of worried that if it gets on the ballot, could it pass? And that's a concern. I'm actually more worried about what is done because of the fear of the ballot proposal and less because of the ballot proposal, because I think most Ohioans will ultimately reject it. But in the meantime, if the General Assembly says, all right, we're going to jump and go ahead and, say lop property taxes in half, well, that's an equally horrifying proposal. So I think there's an understanding. You know what? It might be less. I shouldn't say it might be. I would think it's less the property tax proposal than it is, worry over their constituents voting them out because they didn't do enough. And I know folks will complain, well, what do the Republicans have to worry about in a general election? But they do have to worry about primaries for sure. And there's no shortage of people that want to run against them in primaries and could use this as an issue to potentially beat them. But again, I think the bigger threat is from what we do in the meantime. Because remember, as Zach pointed out, this was in the late 70s, early 80s. We had House Bill 920, the tax reduction factors, no unvoted taxes like we had back then, hence the tax reduction factors. And how well did that work out? It didn't work out well at all for the next time that inflation rolled around, which is today. So, yeah, I think it's a combination of factors.
All right, let's, before we get to questions from the audience and questions people submitted, let's talk about what's actually on the table in Columbus and maybe what you guys wish was on the table in Columbus. So there are 4 property tax bills that are expected to get to the governor's desk probably by the end of this week. For those who like bill numbers, it is House Bill 335, House Bill 186, House Bill 129, and House Bill 309, and they all do different things. Very, very briefly, when we were talking about schools and that 20 mil floor, it would cap the rate that could increase to inflation. There's a similar system for inside millage that would also get a cap pegged to inflation. So no matter what your home value did, that could only rise. It's going to change the way schools calculate and get to that 20 mil floor. That's another one. And then there is this pitch in House Bill 309 to give county budget commissions new powers to lower property taxes. So, Zach, I would love to get your take on the 4 different bills that are very likely headed to the governor by the end of the week.
Well, that would probably take a while, but I guess to try and summarize, the one proposal to allow county budget commissions to reduce levies is a thoroughly undemocratic move that flies in the face and really shows how hypocritical its supporters are, because all of their rhetoric has been around, we need to give the voters power. We need to let the voters decide. Allow county budget commissions, which consist of the county auditor, the county treasurer, and the county prosecutor, the ability to reduce levies that voters have only just approved. Now, there are certain restrictions on that, but I think that's an incredible kind of undemocratic move that I would certainly hope, for instance, the League would oppose on that basis. The other measures, I think the things that they do altogether without probing each of them separately is they cut pretty substantially the amount of funding that will be coming. I think the actual amounts will vary because there's an interaction between these bills. And so we don't even know now. If they're voting right now, they won't even know exactly how much they're cutting. But they're cutting many hundreds of millions of dollars, mostly to schools, but also to local governments in funding, continuing the pattern that we've already seen and exaggerating the problems we've already witnessed. At the same time as the property tax relief that's being delivered is not being delivered on a targeted basis. And so, for example, House Bill 186, which has the largest amount of this, which would cut how much those at the 20 mil floor are able to generate. It would provide tax relief in Indian Hill, which is by most measures the richest community in Ohio. And it would not provide tax relief in East Cleveland, the poorest community in Ohio, or 5 of the other 9 poorest communities in Ohio, or all of the major cities in Ohio except Cincinnati. And so that is because they're not at the 20 mil floor. Well, we got all kinds of people here in Cleveland who are having major property tax issues despite the fact that they're not at the 20 mil floor because they happen to live in a gentrifying area. So this is not targeted. It's a blunt instrument that's providing relief to some people who need it, but others who don't. And it's cutting the amount of funds available for public services. And I think fundamentally to me, what it signifies is that the legislature right now is not in a mood to say we have some basic levels of public services that need to be maintained. The inside millage, if I'm not mistaken, was reduced from 15 to 10 mils in the Great Depression. So in the Great Depression, legislators decided, despite the incredible number of foreclosures and whatnot at that time, that there was a minimum that had to be maintained, that you had to have certain amounts of tax revenue available for public services. And I think that while we've staved off some of the most extreme measures, like the earlier proposal to eliminate inside millage, $4 billion a year, I think that it's quite disturbing to me that we're seeing the level of cuts that we are, together with the lack of targeting, when there are measures available to do that Senator Blessing, in fact, has authored.
Yeah, I want to, before we get into the things that we would like to see on the table, I would like to say these four bills are up in a Senate committee tomorrow at 9 a.m. if you're curious about them. I should also note that they could all be getting amendments tomorrow morning, so they could be changing in pretty substantial ways before they pass. But Senator Blessing, what is your take? Because it looks like you and the Senate will be taking a vote on these four bills tomorrow afternoon.
Yes. So, well, not to belabor the point too much with this, I've was originally a no on all four of them. I'm still a no on 129, 309, and 335. And yes, you do mention amendments. There is one potentially to 186 that if it gets in it's given me some pause because it's impacting something that I've wanted to see done for a very, very long time. And I think it's something that has massive bipartisan support. But that said, all of these bills, absent that particular reform, and obviously there's a sales tax holiday appropriation in there.
They're getting rid of it to pay for some relief. Yeah.
Yes, to shore up some school districts directly in 186. None of this is going to help at all. And it's because all it's really doing is shifting local dollars around. And it's been a big issue for me for the longest time that that's not going to solve any problem because it presumes that, hey, they got all these dollars from the valuation increases and they don't need them. It's unjustified. And I would strongly disagree with that. To point out to some of my colleagues, when you look at Ohio nationally for school funding, which is our largest budget item, we're 37th in the country in per pupil state level public education funding. We're 15th for local level per pupil funding, which means property tax related, for the most part, funding. But when you add up all funds, including federal, we're 25th. So, would it be more meaningful if we simply just funded the fair school funding formula and then watched all the school districts over time just say, look, we're not going to go for new money. We can go for renewals because we can rely on the state dollars and watch these things become healthier. The net effect of these bills is going to be a ton of levies going onto the ballot in 26. A good number, if not, well, a good number of them are going to pass. And in the process, a lot of these folks are going to point the finger at the General Assembly that, hey, this is the inevitable. This is why we're going to the ballot, because we lost money from this. And, I don't think it's going to do anything beyond that. I mean, I hate to be so cynical about it, but that's really what it is. And remember, looking at various school board members throughout the state, this is the big issue that I've tried to pitch to my colleagues in caucus, which, yes, these are nonpartisan races, but if you look at county commissioners and countywide offices throughout Ohio, they're dominated by the Republican Party to the tune of like 80 to 90%. I would be willing to wager that 2/3 of the school board members in this state are Republican. So what are we effectively saying? We're saying, hey, we are fiscally responsible at the state level, but not fiscally responsible at the local level, yet it's Republicans who are by and large in charge of both. I'm sorry, I just don't buy it.
I wanted to talk a little bit about what you guys wish or would hope to see. So, Zach, I was hoping you could explain what a circuit breaker is, because this is something that has come up a lot. It tends to have bipartisan support, but it goes absolutely nowhere.
Yes, I'd be delighted. And as I said, Senator Blessing has a bill, actually, I think two bills that would take this in. One of them is Senate Bill 22 and the other is Senate Bill 190. So I'll put in a lobbying pitch for those. But the way a circuit breaker works is it says if you're paying more than a certain amount of your income in property tax, then the state will pick up some or all of the rest. And so in the case of the bill that Senator Blessing has, which actually we worked with the senator on it, it says if you're spending more than 5% of your income on property tax, the state will give you a credit, an income tax credit or a rebate of up to $1,000. And there are certain guidelines that you have to be below a certain income level. Your house can't be worth, $1 million. And the key elements of this are the state pays for it. And so this does not harm local jurisdictions, schools, et cetera. And it's targeted at those people who actually need it because they're spending more than a certain percentage of their income on property tax. Now, those numbers can be completely changed. There are 29 states that have either a circuit breaker or something like it, including Michigan and West Virginia. Pennsylvania has kind of a cruder form of it. In Michigan, when it's over 3.2% of your income, the state will pick up to, I think it's like $1,700 of your tax. But it's a little more complicated than that. But the point is, this is a very mainstream idea. It's done in Missouri and Oklahoma and Vermont. I mean, it's not a red or a blue state kind of thing. The key problem, and it has the endorsement of the AARP, practically every local government and school organization in the state that testified when Senator Blessing's bill was around about a year and a half ago. So you ask, well, why hasn't this happened? And I guess maybe the senator can answer that better than I, but I think the main point is it's going to cost money. So his proposal was said to cost somewhere around $800 or $900 million a year. We have that money. We have it in the form of any number of tax breaks that we could cut. And I was encouraged to see with House Bill 186 that the legislature, or the House anyway, agreed to put some of the sales tax holiday money into funding that. And I think it just indicates that we have sources of revenue that we could use to pay for property tax relief, and we could easily do it if we weren't busy cutting income taxes. So it's something of a mystery to me on some level. Why isn't that what's embraced? This is not a radical scheme. It's been well tested, and yes, and they can also structure it the way they want. Like you could have it be a lower amount, you could have marginal rates, you could have more or less than $1,000. Vermont goes up to 8,000, believe it or not.
Oh, wow.
So I think that, again, it's something the legislature could really fashion as it found it most useful. And to me, it's very regrettable that they haven't done that, because I think that would actually provide relief to the people who actually need it, because there are a lot of people who need property tax relief. There is no question, but it is not most people in Ohio. I live in what is one of, if not the highest taxing jurisdiction in the state, and I don't need property tax relief. I mean, yes, my taxes went up somewhat, but just because you happen to live in Ohio does not mean you really need property tax relief. So we need to distinguish, and I think that's what a circuit breaker does.
Senator Blessing, you also have another very unique idea. It is a proposed amendment to the Constitution that would let local communities pass land taxes without going to a vote. Can you kind of explain what the heck this is?
Yes, this is Senate Joint Resolution 7. And without going into too deep a detail, you guys can do your own research. But economists, by and large, throughout the centuries, have touted the land value tax as the perfect tax. It doesn't distort the economy. It, in the case of Henry George, he believed that it could be the only tax that you would need to fund all of your public goods as well as offer a citizen's dividend. That I don't know about that per se, but there is a lot of logic in what he's thinking. So unlike a property tax, which is a tax on land and improvements thereon, this is just a tax on the land. And of course, this would take a constitutional amendment, not because the Constitution directly prohibits land value taxes, but simply because it authorizes taxes on land and improvements thereon, which has been interpreted to mean, property taxes. So this authorizes it at the state level. And at the same time, it says that it can only be directly elected boards that do this. So if you're an unelected board, you can't levy a land value tax. But you're right. The key in this is, well, before I get into that, the reason that this is actually, I think, very good is it also kills two birds with one stone in the sense that it will help fund local governments, but also it is a very pro-density, pro-housing tax in that you pay a premium if you just sit on land in an urban area, for example, whereas you pay less tax if you're building a dense apartment or something to that effect because you're making the most efficient use of land. But here's the thing, when we increase housing like that, we're growing the tax pie, so to speak, so that we will be able to achieve a larger economy of scale. And though the tax revenue will be going up in the aggregate, the amount that each individual pays would be going down because there are more people paying into that system, which is ultimately a good thing. Now, not voting on it is something that my colleagues look at me like, what are you talking about? Why wouldn't we vote on this? We need democratic oversight. And I've told them we do have democratic oversight. All of these boards, from school districts to townships to cities to counties, for the case of land value taxes, are already the board members are already elected by the people. That is the democratic oversight. But here's the thing: in Kentucky and Pennsylvania, those states both, for just to use the school districts as an example, they set their property tax rates the beginning of the year, and that's the way it's going to be for the year. Could you imagine how much that would greatly simplify things in Ohio? The whole concept of a levy, gone. You don't need to go to the ballot. Your elected members will set that rate based on what they need. Inside millage, irrelevant at that point. The 20 mil floor, I mean, maybe somewhat relevant, but not as much in that case. Cash reserves. This was one of the big issues where people complained, oh, these school districts are hoarding money. They're sitting on 100% of their expenditures in this cash reserve. Well, no kidding, because they have to go to the ballot. They can't rely on state dollars as much. Federal dollars increasingly are at risk, whether it's Title I or IDEA or you name it. So yeah, it behooves them to have a high cash reserve. However, if they can set their own rates, no way. I think their cash reserves would be way lower organically because they simply don't need to do that. Plus, in the end, they have a lot of flexibility that at a time like this, they might say, well, it's an inflationary period. We are elected at the ballot. Okay, we'll give you a little bit of property tax relief now, knowing that in the future we can, get that back as things settle down. This would add so much flexibility, reduce so much acrimony in the world of local government that it would be just unbelievable. And with a land value tax, you can't really overtax that without getting to a point where the citizens rebel against that. Unlike a property tax where, hey, if you have a nice power plant in your district, you can levy a property tax rate and make them pay the bulk of it. That doesn't work with a land value tax. So it decouples that and really incentivizes economic growth in a way that we don't have it right now. So for what it's worth, a number of business community folks like it. I had a woman from Legal Aid in Cincinnati say, my God, why are we not doing this in Cincinnati? All these empty plots of land could be easily redeveloped. I think the time is ripe for something like a land value tax. And, the more I talk about it with my colleagues, the more they're like, why are we not doing this? But, you need to get over the hump of this is something that needs to go to the ballot. We tend to be allergic to that sort of thing. But in this case, I think it's a clear winner.
We've got a couple of questions coming in. I just want to remind you, you can submit them in the chat if you have a question for either of our panelists. I do want to ask Zach one more question before we start getting to yours, mostly because I get to, and I would love to get his take on this. So one of the things that I have found in covering property taxes is that about 17% of all property statewide in Ohio, roughly $89 billion worth of property, was exempt from taxation in 2024. So some of that is houses of worship, some of it is our government buildings, others are nonprofits, but some of them are under abatement, meaning we have set aside collecting taxes for a period of time. But 17% of the property in the state, Zach, isn't actually paying property taxes. Is it time to have a larger conversation about some of these exemptions and abatements?
The short answer, yes. And I actually have an appointment on Friday to go talk with Representative Dave Thomas, who's the author of much of the legislation we've been talking about. There is a bill, House Bill 540, that's very, very narrow, but it would cause the Nature Conservancy to have to pay tax or pay payments in lieu of taxes on some land it owns in Adams County. And I'm not sure whether I support that. I don't think that Adams County has a particularly high level of nonprofit or exempt property. But yes, I mean, and in fact, we have done several studies over the years looking at how the major nonprofit hospitals here in Cleveland, the Cleveland Clinic, they only pay modest taxes on those assets they have that are not charitable, like a hotel or something. And yet they're the biggest employers. In years gone by, General Motors, Ford, Republic Steel, these companies paid a lot of taxes, and here we have the biggest employers that are basically not paying taxes, and they say, oh well, our employees are. Well, those are their employees, not them. So, but then in addition to the nonprofits, of that 80-some billion you talk about, the biggest share of it, 26 billion, is in tax abatements. And the amount of tax abatements has absolutely skyrocketed. We have half of that is what's called tax increment financing. I don't think you want a course on that here this evening, but basically it means developers are getting back some of the money that instead they would have been paying in property tax. And this is again an example of something that started out as a great idea to help in distressed areas and has now been used for all kinds of other purposes. And it's especially rampant in Franklin County and Hamilton County, where much larger shares of property are off the books because of that. And I think we need, if we're talking about votes, how about having votes about these tax abatements? How about saying that every TIF over a certain size has to go to a vote? I'm going to ask Mr. Thomas what he thinks of that idea, since he's big on voting on taxes. But I think, there is a hint that the majority in the legislature has an interest in some of this. In the most recent budget, despite the cut in the income tax, which I strongly opposed, and some other, property tax actions I wasn't crazy about, there were a number of tax breaks that were repealed. They were worth over $300 million a year, mostly sales tax breaks of one sort or another. And we've got $11 billion worth of state tax breaks at the state level, not those are on state taxes, not the property tax. But I think that there is at least some appetite for that. And I'm very much hoping that we can see that happen at both the state and local level.
So one of the questions that we had come in dealt with the municipal income tax, which is actually another complicated sort of wonky part of the way Ohio taxes. So I'm sure lots of you who work in one place and live in another pay taxes potentially to two different locations, right? You pay where you work and where you live, and maybe you get a credit for where you live, maybe you don't. Um, but she wanted to know whether either panelist sees for changes to the municipal income tax or perhaps being folded into state taxes and how that sort of factors into this. So we'll start with you, Senator Blessing. Do you see changes coming to the municipal income tax system?
Yeah, I think Representative Romer has a bill that deals with this. With respect to reciprocity and whatnot, that has to go to the ballot. I haven't really looked at it too in depth. I don't think we could ever really get rid of municipal income taxes because of home rule and some constitutional language that allows them to do something like that. For example, I mean, they have their own inside mills, municipalities do, with respect to up to 1% of an income tax can be levied without a vote of the people. But, interestingly enough, if I were to do some sort of reform in this space, sadly, it would take a constitutional amendment for that. But, the reciprocity reform I could live with if the municipalities and local governments could be sort of the masters of their own universe, where they didn't have to go to the ballot on things like this. Again, because the elected representation is the oversight there. Interestingly enough, with respect to schools and a lot of people saying, hey, let's have the schools shift on over to a school district income tax. Well, if you gave them, 10 inside mills on income tax the way that cities do, I guarantee you that they would shift in a hurry, simply because it's much easier to do that by majority vote than have to go to the ballot. So I think you'd see a number of levies lapse in favor of something like that. But in the end, I really don't want to attack local governments on this sort of thing. It's for me, I think it's actually a good feature that we have a number of taxing jurisdictions that have, the ability to say, look, this is how we want to run our local government. This is how we're going to do it. And that's that. So, I don't think that's something that makes Ohio a bad place to live. I think it's actually kind of a unique thing for Ohio that's worth preserving.
Zach, we have a
Let me just say one
question.
other thing about this.
Oh, sure. Go for
I
it.
think there's one fact about Ohio taxes that needs to be borne in mind, whatever tax we're talking about. And that is, we have lower taxes than the rest of the country. You look at what the Census Bureau puts out. We have, the last time they looked, I believe, the per capita tax in Ohio of all the state and local taxes together was about $5,800, and nationally it was well over $7,000. And the same is true if you do it as a share of income, even though Ohio incomes are a little below the national average. So we have a tax system that is not, we don't have high taxes in this state. You might think that we do, given all that we see in the legislature, but we don't. And I think that when you look at the municipal income tax, you need to look at it through that lens, because this is the main way that we finance cities. If Cleveland didn't go broke since its unfortunate situation in the 70s, which had nothing to do with real finance, it had to do with the power situation between the mayor and the business community, Cleveland would have long since gone broke if we did not have the kind of municipal income tax that we have. And I dare say the same would be true of a whole bunch of cities across the state. I think that, in fact, that we have commuters paying the income tax is one of the highlights and the positive features of Ohio's tax system. And it does allow us to have the kind of home rule that we do have, because we can support those services. And so I see this as almost like, well, now that they've slashed the income tax more than half, what I would like to see for the municipal income tax, which I think Senator Blessing is probably familiar with, even it may not be directly his district. There are two communities in Ohio that are allowed to tax unearned income under the municipal income tax, meaning They tax dividends and capital gains and interest.
Oh.
And what do you think those two communities are? Well, they're Indian Hill, which I mentioned earlier, which is probably the richest community in Ohio, and Wyoming, which is not too far behind. So here we have a couple of the richest communities where we're always told, oh, you tax us, we're going to leave. You tax us too much, we're going to leave. They're the communities that are taxing interest and dividends and capital gains. Well, why don't we do that statewide? I think that'd be a great idea.
Zach, there's a question that came in from Valerie in the chat that I think you might be good to answer. She wants to know what we can do to change the narrative that paying taxes is bad and something that we should try to avoid.
Well, I mean, that's the $64 question, because I don't think any of us have been able to answer that as we would like to. I can't say, oh, well, here's the magic dust that you can pour on it to make sure that that happens. I think I remember a comment from Governor Celeste's wife, Dagmar Celeste, who said that we should put a sign on everything that's paid for with taxes and make clear that that's how it's paid. I think that we generally just think of the taxes, we think of government. We don't think of what the services are that those provide. And that's the whole thing. I mean, we don't need taxes except for what they support. And so I think, my arguments, which obviously have not been wildly successful, given that I've been doing this for over 20 years and we've seen the income tax cut in half. But I almost always try and talk about what are the services that we so badly need? Why is it that colleges are unaffordable in this state? Why do we have kids still being poisoned by lead in this state? Something that we've known about for how many decades? What caused that? Why is it that we have kids who have to pay for extracurricular activities? Why do we have unaffordable childcare and inaccessible childcare so that parents can't work because they have to stay home because it costs so much to take your kids to childcare? These are things that taxes can pay for and should pay for. And that's why we need more taxes to pay for those services. Now, I can't say I've been very effective, but that's about the best I can do for you.
Senator Blessing, we have a technical question about your constitutional amendment. He wants to know, what is the case law precedent that you're referring to that would make your amendment necessary? So his question is, if our Constitution is silent on land value only taxes, why do we interpret it as land and improvements?
So that's a good question. This came from LSC when I asked about this. We do land value taxes in statute, and they pointed me to Article 12, Section 2 again, where it says specifically land and improvements thereon. I didn't look at the case law, but they said that has just been interpreted as meaning property taxes. And because it didn't specifically say, you can tax land and land alone, that it's therefore not authorized. They seem to be pretty adamant about that. So maybe there is a possibility to do it, but in the end, I kind of like having it as a separate constitutional amendment now, because we talked about some of these tax breaks before, like TIFs and CRAs. If you read SJR 7, I was very careful to, like the property tax, carve out public land and houses of worship, but there is an absolute prohibition on, things like CRAs and TIFs and exemptions and abatements and whatnot. So they can't do that because it would then be unconstitutional, which is one of the things that I think has hung up property taxes. But I mean, we can always get you more research on it, but it was LSC that said, look, you need a constitutional amendment for this.
They're usually pretty good about that stuff. Sometimes when they aren't sure if it's legal, they'll have these very funny little notes at the bottom, like, this might be an issue constitutionally. And you're always like, But Zach, we got a question. We actually got a couple questions, but I'm going to pick this one about how vouchers for private schools have impacted public school funding and how that factors into this conversation.
Well, I mean, we're spending $1 billion a year on vouchers, and I mean, it would be pretty easy to say that if we weren't doing that, we would have that money to invest in regular public schools. So I think that it has been a drain on our public school funding, and so I think that's a bad idea. So that hasn't proven itself either, for that matter. But I don't know if that answers her question, but maybe it was a setup.
I can opine
So
on it too, if need be.
yeah,
So, I mean, yes, it is over $1 billion, and it is actually, even though it's means tested, it's not means tested in any meaningful sense at this point, because when we talk about vouchers, we inevitably, there are a number of scholarships, but we're talking at choice, traditional and income based. So traditional, if you're in quote unquote a failing school district, irrespective of income, you get the full scholarship amount. Otherwise, the income based goes up to, you get a full scholarship amount up to 450% of the federal poverty level, which last time I checked, that's like 150 grand of household income for a family of four. And then it slowly phases down to, a single digit percentage of the full scholarship amount. Now, admittedly, when this was going on, the House knocked it up to 400% in their proposal, 450% in their proposal a couple budgets ago. And I had made the proposal, all right, let's just call it universal, but start the phase down at 250%, but it was very steep. And 250%, if you think about where income is, it's kind of like this bell curve. And if you're way beyond the bell curve to the right, it's effectively universal. 250% probably wasn't, I didn't look into this, but it probably wasn't past the middle of the bell curve. But then, of course, when the Senate made its change, it was way beyond what I had thought it was. And when I was originally making that pitch to call it universal, it was to end this and not have this discussion anymore. And for what it's worth, the Democrats were like, if this is the end of this, we're in favor of it, because then, call it universal and call it a day. But I think it's, since so much is, the bulk of the bell curve is captured, it is way more expensive than it had to be. And of course, since it's effectively a flat amount, then it inflates the actual tuition. And worse, it actually harms who this was originally intended for, which were, poor kids in poorly performing school districts. Now, think about it this way. If you have a universal flat voucher amount, if you're a Catholic school, to use as an example in Cincinnati, because there are quite a few of them, who are you going to take first if everybody gets the same scholarship amount? Are you going to take the wealthier kids first, or are you going to take the poorer kids first? And I think we all know the answer is they're probably going to take the wealthiest kids first, and then the middle class, and then the poor kids are going to be shut out. And frankly, the tuition will never be below the scholarship amount. It'll always be above it. I've seen it happen now for a couple of years in a row where they just keep raising it as the state keeps raising money. So I think at some point that's going to have to be dealt with. And I would tell my colleagues, be careful, based on what happened in Kentucky, where Kentucky voted for Trump 2-1, but then they shot down private vouchers 2-1 in the same ballot. That could happen here in Ohio if something like that did go to the ballot. But the only thing I might dispute, I wouldn't even call it a dispute with Zach, is that, let's say we, went back to the voucher system, a decade ago and really ratcheted this back. There's no guarantee that this would go into public education. As much as I'd like it to go that way, there's a strong possibility they could use it to wipe out what remains of the CAT, the commercial activities tax, or even lower the income tax further. Although it's getting harder and harder to do that because each quarter percentage point is astronomically expensive now that it's a flat tax. So that's kind of where I would go with that.
we're getting down to the end of our time, but I do want to make sure that we answer this one question. There were several questions about how to lobby your legislators, how to communicate how you feel about these things, how to get a hold of folks. So, Senator, I'll let it start with you, and then part of Zach's job is getting meetings with lawmakers. Although I suppose that's part of my job as well. So I suppose we can all offer some sort of suggestion. But Senator, what's the best way to convince you to change your mind if you're being lobbied by someone?
Well, I mean, you talk to somebody like Paula Hicks Hudson, and she would say, okay, if you're talking to Senator Blessing, you're talking to a unicorn, somebody who's not really, this isn't, it's not like you're speaking to another Republican. So my first advice to you guys would be learn to speak Republican. And I've told the public education folks this as well, that it is in their best interest to be able to come in there, maybe with a local Republican that they know, and pitch your case. I think that's really helpful in the grand scheme of things to be able to do something like that. Also, don't assume that they know exactly what you're talking about, why you're trying to do what you're doing. That's also helpful. And I don't know how to really do this. I think, and in some groups are starting to reach out and work in a different way. So a good example of this lately has been the AFL-CIO, who has been talking to me that, like, hey, look, we recognize that the Senate is Republican, the House is Republican, the governor is Republican. How do we work with members of your caucus? But at the same time, we recognize we've obviously endorsed Democrats in the past, but how do we work with them? And again, I've just told them, find somebody that's local, that they might know, that is a member of the AFL-CIO, for example, and just chat with them. But also be very, like, all right, if you guys are willing to work with us here, we're willing to sing your praises locally, as opposed to where I've seen it before with things like payday lending reform. When we did that, and some of the reformers were like, we don't need you to need to thank you for doing the right thing. You did the right thing. That's your job. Well, it goes a long way to see members that you might otherwise be opposed to, doing what you want them to do, and then making sure that people know that they did the right thing and that you're proud of them for that. Not many members here thank you very often. And when it comes from groups that they've typically had a relatively antagonistic relationship with, it really does go a long way.
Well, I'd just add, see if you can learn something about the person or persons you're talking to. Sometimes it can be a personal detail, like where they went to college, or you can establish some kind of rapport in a way that may not be directly on the issue that you're talking with them about, but it creates some feeling of solidarity, or that may be too strong a word, but some meeting of the minds. I would also, even though you may only have limited time, I would let the conversation wander if necessary. So you don't feel totally, I'd say the bill that I am most proud of, because, we don't get that many bills at Policy Matters Ohio passed that are literally our creation, that are something we thought up and asked a legislator about. We have a lot of them that we support, but one of the few examples of that was a case where a Republican legislator wanted to talk to me about a proposal that he had. And we talked about it, and I wasn't really keen on a lot of it, but we talked about it. And then by chance, I don't even remember how, it went on to a different topic, which I interested him in. It had to do with work sharing and allowing people to get unemployment insurance if a company cut its workforce. Instead of laying people off, it had people work, say, 4 days a week, and then you could get unemployment for that fifth day. Well, we actually got that bill through the legislature, and it was the product of this completely fortuitous, or what's the right word? It wasn't the product of me going in and trying to convince the guy of that. I was there on a whole other issue. So I think it shows you serendipity plays a real role. And so let serendipity happen. Try and learn what you can. I'm here in Cleveland, and I still make an attempt, if I can, to meet people in the district, which is, of course, easier for you too if you're not in Columbus. But so that's one other thing that I try and do that may make it a little easier to schedule meetings rather than those 2 days that they're cramming meetings and going to hearings and so forth.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. So I want to say thank you so much to Zach and to Senator Blessing for taking some time. And I'm going to turn it back over to Catherine. So thank you guys all so much. And really quick, if you ever want to get a hold of me, you have a property tax question, you take an issue with something that I have written about property taxes, it's astaver@cleveland.com. You can also find me on like X or social media. I'm really easy to find. If you ever have a question, like the door's always open.
Thank you very much, Anna. And as you mentioned, this concludes our Let's Talk Taxes program. Thank you to everyone that joined us tonight. Engaged, respectful policy discussion is essential to a functioning democracy, and we appreciate that we could facilitate such a discussion tonight. The League would like to give a giant thank you to Anna Staver, Senator Blessing, and Zach Schiller for their time, expertise, and willingness to participate in this discussion. A special thank you goes to the Cincinnati Area League of Women Voters for helping out to put this program together. Thank you to League members and leaders, Peter Petto, Claire Wagner, Linda Lally, Karen Leith, and Catherine Hexter for your time and efforts in putting together and running this program. Tonight's program was recorded and will be posted to the Greater Cleveland League of Women Voters YouTube channel. The YouTube channel is listed on the final slide displayed now. If you would like to learn more about tax issues in Ohio, there are a number of additional resources on the last slide as well. Thank you again to everyone that joined us and to everyone that helped make this program possible. Good night, everyone.